This meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 26 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 sub 3, the committee is meeting today and it studies in the main estimates 2026-2027 and the current state of civic resilience in Canada. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, members in person and remotely on Zoom. As per usual, if you want to be recognized, put up your hand, whether you're on Zoom or in person. A reminder that all comments should be addressed to the chair. And, consult the card in front of you, the guidelines for written on the cards on the table. This is to prevent audio feedback incidents, protect the health and safety of everyone, especially our interpreters. Before we begin, the members have received a copy of the draft budget for the study on the current state of civic resilience in Canada. Is there a motion to adopt the budget? Excellent. Any opposition? Seeing none, the budget is adopted. I would now like to welcome our witnesses, who is back by popular demand, one of our number one witnesses, number one in your hearts. From the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer, Stéphane Perreault, who's the Chief Electoral Officer, and Marc Limoges, the Chief Financial Officer. Please go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, de me donner l'occasion.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the opportunity to speak to the committee today about the 2026-2027 main estimates for my office and explain some of our priorities for this upcoming fiscal year. The Office of the Chief Electoral Officer, which includes the Office of the Commissioner of Canada Elections, is funded under two distinct authorities: an annual appropriation, which covers the salaries of indeterminate staff, and an ongoing statutory authority for all other expenses. This funding model ensures the independence of my office by ensuring access to the funds required to prepare for and deliver elections, which may occur at any time. The annual appropriation for 2026-27 amounts to $69 million and represents the salaries for some 600 indeterminate positions. This is the amount voted on by Parliament. Planned spending under the statutory authority is reported annually for transparency and accountability. For 2026-27, the planned spending is $205 million. Planned spending under the statutory authority covers all expenses and includes work conducted in preparation of electoral events, but not the delivery cost of elections and by-elections, the timing of which cannot be predicted. As we are in a minority government, Election Canada's overarching priority is ensuring readiness to deliver an election. This includes implementing measures identified based on lessons from the 45th general election, such as improvements to special ballot procedures and controls identified in a report that I shared with the committee last November. We have also been engaging with organizations and communities in Nunavik to better serve electors. Notably, we are collaborating with the Kativik Regional Government and the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, ITK, the national organization that represents Inuit in Canada, to remove barriers to electoral participation and improve the voting experience for Inuit electors. Additionally, we hired a new returning officer who is currently visiting all communities to ensure a better understanding of the reality and resources on the ground. Similar work is being done with Indigenous communities across the country. I would also like to thank the committee for the approval of Election Canada's pilot project to include Inuktitut on federal election ballots in Nunavut. I am hopeful that I will be appearing later this spring before the Standing Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs to seek their approval.
Finalize the audits of financial returns submitted by candidates, political parties, and third parties for the last general election. Our new risk-based audit approach using data analytics allows us to identify areas of risk in a more efficient manner and to better target our audits. Problematic files can be referred more quickly to the Commissioner of Canada Elections to ensure fairness and timely compliance outcomes. As of today, 11 months after the 45th general election, I can confirm that we have almost completed the audits, and this is much, much sooner than in the past, where it would take normally 24 months. I would also like to point out that in 2025, we received funding to increase capacity for the Office of the Commissioner of Canada Elections and to make permanent core staff for our social media monitoring unit. Finally, Mr. Chair, as we go through a series of minority governments, it is critical that Elections Canada not lose sight of the importance of renewing and modernizing its infrastructure with the goal of reducing technological debt, replacing legacy systems, and offering better services to Canadians. We are now completing the first phase of Elections Canada's digital strategy, which began in 22-23, and initiating the second phase. The first phase included the relocation of Elections Canada's data centre and a simplified data architecture to better support our systems, and that is complete. A new payroll system for election workers will be completed this year, and we will continue the development of a secure online portal for political entities, as well as the use of electronic voters lists to expedite voting operations and reduce administrative errors at the polls. As we look towards the second phase, we are beginning to plan a second wave of initiatives. This could include, for example, the development of electronic voter information cards, VICs, in response to growing challenges with the timely delivery of paper VICs. Electronic VICs would serve as a complement to paper VICs, which would continue to be issued. So thank you for inviting me today, and I would be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Monsieur Perreault. I will now turn to Mr. Cooper for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Perreault. The rogue so-called longest ballot committee is at it again, this time targeting the by-election in Terrebonne. As of this morning, I noticed that there were 42 independent candidates that have been approved or certified to run in Terrebonne out of 48 or 49 candidates. I understand that the window for certification is up until 2 p.m. tomorrow that Elections Canada has, with the filing deadline having been yesterday. So approximately how many candidates can we expect, fake candidates, candidates that this committee has put forward?
So the count is final, and we have in total 48 candidates for Terrebonne.
And 42 are independent.
I believe that's the case, but
Okay.
the total is what matters from my perspective.
Right. Well, 48 candidates, 42 that are independents. We know that the longest ballot committee's activities have created barriers for certain voters. Their actions have made it more difficult for voters to handle and mark their ballot. Voters have experienced longer wait times, and it has taken a lot longer to count ballots and get election results. So given all of those issues that have arisen in past by-elections and elections, what steps is Elections Canada taking to mitigate potential disruptive effects of the longest ballot committee?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I have decided yesterday, in light of the final count, to opt for the approach that we took in Battle River Crowfoot and have a write-in ballot. This is an approach that did work well in the last time that we used it. It proved to be satisfactory. 97% of voters found it easy to use, and we had very few complaints about the use of that ballot. So we felt that this was a better experience for the voters in general. As in Battle River Crowfoot, there will be a list of candidates presented in two formats. It'll presented alphabetically, as well as on one side, and on the other side by candidates affiliated with parties or endorsed by parties, and independent. So that allows voters to navigate a complex information in the manner that best suits them. And that, again, was used in Battle of River Crowfoot, and it worked well.
You said it worked well. I would agree with you that it works a lot better than a meter or meter and a half long ballot. But I would assume that it would still present difficulties for some voters, those who might have physical disabilities, those with literacy challenges, among other impediments. So I would take it that this is not an ideal situation. It's the best that can be done in a set of difficult circumstances because of the malicious activities of the longest ballot committee. Is that fair?
It is the lesser evil, is the way I would put it.
Okay, thank you for that. And just moving on to a different topic associated with the longest ballot committee and a complaint that had been put forward by Mr. Davies, who appeared before this committee, Ryan Davies. He had submitted a complaint on July 25th to Elections Canada. He raised the matter of his complaint when he appeared before this committee. When you came subsequent to his appearance, you said you first learned of it upon him testifying at committee, but that when you followed up as to where the complaint had gone, it was caught by a security filter.
Yeah.
Now, you further testified that the physical complaint itself was not transferred to the Commissioner of Elections Canada, but assured the committee that the Commissioner was seized of the complaint. However, in an answer to an undertaking you subsequently provided to the committee, you indicated that the report or the complaint had in fact been transferred to the Commissioner of Elections Canada sometime between July 31st and August 11th. So there is an inconsistency or a discrepancy between what you first said, that it wasn't physically transferred, to your later undertaking that it in fact was transferred to the Commissioner of Elections Canada. So can you explain?
I'd have to go back. Again, I don't want to mislead the committee in any way, shape, or form. What I can say is that all of the relevant information was made available to the commissioner. She is aware, of course, of Mr. Davies. She has the opportunity to reach out to him and him to her, and that the controls in place to make sure that no complaint is ever lost or omitted have been implemented, so that there are regular hourly checks on the filter, if we can call it that, on the security check, so that it doesn't go unattended.
There were now hourly checks, but there were not hourly checks.
There were not.
There were not. Were there any measures in place before to monitor the security filter?
There were measures, but it had to be prompted to a supervisor. In order to, so the person disposing of a complaint or not looking at it and not referring it, that decision could be made alone without necessarily the check of a supervisor. Now it has to go through a supervisor. So no complaint that is put in the filter is disposed of or not followed up on unless a supervisor gives it a nod. And that would be the case, for instance, is if there's absolutely no plausible offense under the Act, that's the subject matter of the complaint, or it's irrelevant to, in fact, the activities of the agency, which happens.
Let me just ask you. Let me just ask you this: were any complaints identified that were trapped in the security filter that were not then forwarded to the Commissioner of Elections Canada in a timely manner?
A very quick answer.
Yes, and that's why we have corrections. I believe she has all the information relevant to those complaints, but it's quite possible that some complaints could not have been transferred.
Madame Vargas, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome again to our committee. Obviously, we know that Canadians expect two things from Elections Canada. They expect that our elections remain beyond reproach and that our funds are also managed responsibly. So in that vein, if you could explain how this year's main estimates strike the balance between maintaining constant election readiness and ensuring that we are using taxpayers' dollars prudently, especially in a time where we're not in an election year.
It is a complex one. So maintaining a full state of readiness, absolute ready to go, would cost an additional amount of about $200 million per year. So my role is to monitor the environment and gauge, in addition to what I have now, which already includes readiness expenditures. So my role is to make sure that I can deliver the election, and some deployment decisions take 90 days or 30 days. Recruitment takes a long time. I can tell you, for example, that right now we have partial call centers. They're not fully staffed, but they have to be staffed to a point where if an election is called, then we can catch up and increase the services. So every 2 weeks, we meet as a senior committee and look at the environment and look at the deployment options and gauge whether there is a need to make those additional deployments. Otherwise, the spending would be significantly more substantial.
You identified in your estimates the modernization of information systems as a priority. Maybe if you can tell us how these investments will improve efficiency over time, and what we're expected to see in terms of costs.
I'll give you a good example. We have, and we still have at this point, over 200 databases at Elections Canada. Most of these databases contain essentially the same data elements: the name of people, addresses, additional information, whether they're contributors or whatnot. Each system tends to have its own database, and they have to be updated and managed separately. By having a common data infrastructure, which we built, we will be able, as we migrate all of our systems to that new database, to instantly update all of the systems' underlying data at once. So it's a lot more efficient, a lot faster, and a lot less expensive. That's a good example of how efficiencies can be gained by modernizing our infrastructure. We also are moving towards common platforms so that we don't have for each system a separate data platform or IT platform that needs to be managed by people with different skill sets and whatnot. So one of the goals of the digital transformation initiative is to have a more agile, more efficient data infrastructure. IT infrastructure, sorry.
So, and in the estimates, you also mentioned that you plan to spend $35,000 on regulatory oversight. Can you just tell us what that is and what are the associated costs to that?
So, and I'll let my colleague here look at the cost. It's $37 million. This is the way costs appear in the main estimates are somewhat different the way we structure it internally, but regulatory oversight is essentially political financing, the electoral integrity team, people at Elections Canada to ensure that there is compliance with the rules, and the Commissioner Office's role in ensuring investigations and compliance. So it's a mix of the two.
Everyone right now has had to make cost adjustments. I imagine you also have had to make cost adjustments as well. Are they reflected in these estimates?
They are. I have to be candid here. We are in a minority, and I've had to increase readiness costs, so it doesn't come out as clearly. And there are limits to those cost reductions in that context. We have been asked, and we will be reducing by 5 the number of executives over the next 2 years. And I have reduced our investment plan. I talked about the digital transformation. Our investment plan for this coming year is earmarked at around $10 million. That's down from previous exercises.
And what are the other safeguards? Obviously, if you're making adjustments, like everyone else has been asked to, there are some safeguards that you have to put in place to make sure that our institution that everybody trusts and Canadians trust continues to be without reproach. How are you managing that, and what are the values of those? What are the safeguards that you're putting in place, and what values are you seeing? What kind of conversation you want us to have around that as well?
So, I mean, as I said, we are not subject to the same constraints that most, not all, but most departments are. So we have the ability to maintain our expenditures. I'm conscious of the environment in which we operate, and so I've been a bit more prudent on some discretionary expenditures. But there has been no cuts to any of the controls and integrity functions at Elections Canada. I can tell you, for instance, that the audits of financial returns by political entities, by going from 24 months to 11 or 12 months, we have reduced considerably, and I can't put a number on it today, but considerably the number of consultants that we hire to do those audits. So it's better from a compliance point of view, but it is also less expensive to run.
And what are the impacts
I'll-
on? Oh,
Sorry, I'll cut you off
Thank you.
there. Sorry about that. Madame Normandin, s'il vous plaît, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Perrault. Toujours un plaisir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perrault. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. I would like to start by asking questions on a recommendation that you made on Nunavik. During the last election, you did not have the authorization to allocate more funding before an election in order to do hotel reservations. We might never know when an election will be triggered, but sometimes we have an idea. And I would imagine that the chief electoral officer has funding. So was the issue in that case the fact that spending cannot be said to be allocated to that election if it's done beforehand? It's a communication issue, actually. Our teams are currently planning potential funds for travel, and there are provisions in place for any unforeseen circumstances. We can make spending in advance. There are governing mechanisms for authorization. In that case, it was poor communication. So it was never an issue regarding approving that funding before an election. No. We have our team in the north that is responsible for 17 northern ridings. They work to plan elections in advance and to ensure that all budget authorizations are in place so that everything is accessible when the election comes around. I would like to come back to recommendations now that you made on special ballots. In your recommendations, one had to do with automation and return addresses. Where are we at with those return addresses? Recommendations needed to be made in the fall, and they were made. Same for the spring. Those recommendations were made in February. For automation, we do these tests generally in the summer or beginning of the fall so that we can be prepared just in case an election is triggered, but we do have measures in place for those return addresses. Everything is already in place. There was also a recommendation regarding improving training and oversight for staff. Can you share how that is going to be implemented for the 3 by-elections? That's already been done. There is additional information that was added to these training manuals. We have ensured that the special ballot supervisors have received training. That's already done. You had mentioned as well centralizing certain measures for reviewing these ballots and have the measures been implemented for the coming elections. Reviewing these votes locally is done locally. For international, it's done in Ottawa, but there are mechanisms in place, and we will have a streamlined measures for kits that are sent back so we can ensure that those done at the central administration are examined carefully. We want to ensure that the local offices as well for those ROs have the right number of envelopes to ensure that everything is complete. I have a similar question regarding envelopes and returning these envelopes. Is there anything that will be different from the previous election to these coming by-elections? Yes, there will be a follow-up for national and local ballots. Thank you. I'd like to come back to the matter of training. This might be a question for Monsieur Limoges, but I was wondering what part of the budget or authorities are allocated, and do you need additional funding when recommendations are made regarding training for staff and additional preparation uphill? How do you balance all of that? We have statutory spending, and that is for spending that occurs during an election. If there's training offered during an election or before an election, that is done with a statutory authorization. And as you said, we don't have an issue with liquidity. And at the central administration, we create training and create training programs, and we do that with both indeterminate and determinate staff. And they're part of the annual appropriation, $69 million. Just to conclude, so if you have any additional needs for training, there's no issue with having additional appropriations or funding. It's never a funding issue. It's an availability issue. We recruit 230,000 people during an election period. There are people who have limited availabilities, and it's not work that can be done in advance. So that's the main issue.
For 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Perreault, I just want to pick up where we left off to make sure that I understand your testimony correctly. With regards to the security filter, it's my understanding that there were some complaints that were caught by the security filter that were not identified because Elections Canada did not have in place processes to monitor the security filter, and consequently were not forwarded on to the Commissioner of Elections Canada. Do I have that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So how many complaints were caught by the security filter and not passed on to the Commissioner of Elections Canada?
I would have to come back to the committee. I'm happy to do that.
Are we talking about a handful, or are we talking about...
I'm not aware of others than the one that we mentioned. As I said, the protocols have been revisited so that there's closer scrutiny on that.
And do you know when these, dating back to when? Because presumably this is not a new issue, the security filter.
Correct. So as I said in my I'm not sure what was in the letter in my testimony, but we had protocols in place, and we now have much stricter protocols in place following the last election to make sure that we don't lose sight of any complaints.
Well, since there were certain complaints that were caught, have any been transferred since the check had been done on the security filter to the Commissioner of Elections Canada?
The complaints that would have been disposed of are not retrievable. Okay? I believe, and again, I believe that this is the case for the one from Mr. Davies, though we know that all of the, because there were several sources of information from Mr. Davies and other, including social media. So the information that he had was transferred, but the physical complaint itself, I believe, was not transferred and has been disposed of at the time. That's the best of my recollection.
In the case of his complaint, but what about other complaints?
I'm not aware of any other complaints, but I cannot assure you of that at this point.
Okay. So can you undertake to provide this committee with any additional complaints that were caught by the security screen that were not identified when they date back to, what their status is now, including when and if they were transferred to the Commissioner of Elections Canada, and if those complainants have been informed that their complaints to Elections Canada went into a black hole, because that's precisely what would have happened. Will you undertake to do that?
I'll undertake to look into that. I think it's likely not possible for the following reasons. There's a judgment that is made in examining that security filter as to the relevance of a complaint. In the context of election, we get all kinds of complaints. Complaints about a news outlet being unfair, a politician being rude or inappropriate, that have nothing to do with our mandate or the mandate of the commissioner. And so if those kinds of complaints...
Asking about complaints that Elections Canada is looking at, that's not the issue here. The issue here is that complaints went into or may have gone into a black hole. In other words, they were not acted upon. That is the issue here.
If those complaints are disposed of because they are irrelevant, they are judged to be irrelevant to the mandate, then I can't have a trace. So, and if I do have a number, this number would include, and again, I'll look into it, is my understanding this number would include all of those complaints that are not germane to our mandate. And there would be no way of reopening those complaints to examine. There's a judgment made in the thousands of complaints that we receive. Some of them go into filter for security reasons. I'll look into that to try to answer as best as I can. But if the judgment is that this is not a relevant complaint and it's disposed of, then that's the end of that story.
Well, it seems to be less than desirable that we have complaints that went into a black hole. We don't know how many. We don't know whether, in fact, they were not germane and therefore supposedly disposed of, or whether they, in fact, were germane and not attended to, and who, by the way, was making a determination as to whether the complaint was germane or not germane, when it's not even within the jurisdiction of your office to deal with complaints. That falls within the jurisdiction of the Commissioner of Elections Canada. Why aren't all those complaints passed on to her office?
If any complaint that seemingly falls into her jurisdiction would normally be transferred. We're aware of one situation where it was not, but where all of the information was transferred. But we do get many, many other complaints that are not relevant to my mandate or her mandate, and these would be disposed of. Now, we may have, you listed, Mr. Cooper, a long list of questions. We may have answers to some of them, maybe not others, and I said I will look into it and try to inform the committee to the best of my ability.
Thank you. No, thank you. We're well over. Mr. Lewis, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses, Monsieur Perreault and Ms. Limoges, for appearing before our committee today. We know Elections Canada plays a fundamental role in ensuring that our federal elections are administered fairly and efficiently and in a manner that maintains public confidence in our democratic system, and I appreciate the work that you do to maintain that. And you're here because as parliamentarians, we're reviewing the main estimates. It's important to understand how your agency is preparing operationally and financially to continue to deliver accessible elections across a large and diverse country. So this discussion is helpful in our committee's oversight of your, Canada's election readiness, modernization efforts, and the stewardship of public funds related to electoral administration. I would like to start by focusing on the modernization efforts. You mentioned in your opening statement that you have a core staff for social media, a social media monitoring unit. Can you explain the scope and the size of that, its function, and how fast can a team like that be scaled up in case of an election?
It's a very good question. So we do have a core staff that we amplify. Basically, we augment as we prepare for the election. That core staff used to be funded only through the statutory authority. We began this in 2019 and then continued on in minority context to fill those positions with terms. The good news is that in 2025, we did receive funding to convert 13 of these positions into indeterminate positions. We normally top that up to roughly 20 or 22 positions when we're in full election mode. Of course, it takes roughly 3 months to staff positions, but these can be more complicated positions depending on the linguistic profile to staff. So that is a ballpark explanation.
And can you explain for us the function of a social media monitoring unit?
Yes, it's an important thing. So the role of the unit is to look out for mis or disinformation on the voting process. The role of the unit is not to look out for mis or disinformation on candidates, parties, or issues that may be relevant to political discussions or political choice. Strictly on the electoral process. And one of their important functions ahead of the election is to understand the misinformation and disinformation environment around the world. There are often some narratives that permeate different jurisdictions, and to prepare for that. So in the lead up to the last election, we were able to provide tools for Canadians, including a tool we call ElectoFact, where we listed some common mis or disinformation narratives with correct information. So that was produced as a result of identifying the main trends and risk areas for misinformation. So that's a proactive role that they help conduct. And of course, during the election, they monitor, and then they will either engage social media platforms when they see significant risks to the elector's ability to cast a ballot, or they will typically push out additional information to correct the information.
Thank you for that. You mentioned you're moving toward common platforms, digital transformation. In the departmental plan for the fiscal year 26-27, you mentioned plans to modernize information systems. You talked about replacing legacy systems, a digital strategy, and finishing that first phase by simplifying the data architecture. Can you explain what phase 2 would look like? You mentioned it briefly, but if you can expand what's next, why, what systems are being modernized, what the importance are, and what the challenges are.
So I wish I would be able to tell you that. This June, we'll be sitting as a team to look at priorities for phase 2. What we do know is that we want to maximize our investments in the first phase. So the data infrastructure has been created, but not all systems operate. In fact, they have not migrated to the new data infrastructure. So we need to take care of that migration. We need to prioritize systems that are becoming obsolete and look at how we would replace them. And we need to look at ways to become more agile. We increasingly have seen over the years successive minorities. We talked about readiness and what it means. So our ability to turn into a quicker return to readiness will be also a critical criteria. So at this point, we have general direction, but we haven't landed on the specific initiatives. I mentioned electronic VIX because I think that's a likely candidate, because we are facing a changing environment. And as I've testified, I think on several occasions before this committee, it's not so much the Canada Post challenge, though it's part of that, but the difficulty in securing polling locations means that we have much less time to send those cards to voters. So having the electronic version helps. Currently, voters can go online and proactively get that information, but they're not getting any alerts, for example, of that. So this is the kind of evolution that I'm talking about.
The question I was about to ask when I ran out of time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Looking at the time, what I think, well, I shouldn't say what I think. What I'm going to do is I'll give everyone another minute-ish in their remaining slots, and that'll take us into a break as we prepare for the next panel. So, Madame Normandin, 3.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Perrault, vous avez répondu.
Thank you. Monsieur Perrault, you answered that regarding Terrebonne, because there's a high number of candidates, voters had to write the name of who they wanted to vote for on their write-in ballots, and I was wondering whether or not the name of the party was enough, or is that going to be enough? The rules are clear. The name of the party is not authorized. There were cases where people were misinformed, and so I adapted the rules in that case because there had been misinformation or false information shared. A voter needs to vote for a candidate. We don't pay attention to any errors, any written errors. We just need to be able to identify the candidate for whom one has voted. There will be documents to help voters make their choice. Thank you. Can you talk about recruiting election workers? During our study on the longest ballot committee, we had stated that these ballots might take longer to count. In Terrebonne, there have been 4 elections, by-election, provincial by-election, federal by-election. How are things going with recruiting these workers in Terrebonne? All the indicators are in the green. Recruitment has been done for advanced voting. We're still recruiting for regular voting. We're hoping that long ballots will not stop people from coming to work, but the experience in Battle River Crowfoot showed that it can be managed well, and I'm quite confident. Is it the same for reserving spaces? Yes, voter cards in the 3 ridings were sent out and respected timelines. So for all 3 by-elections, cards have been sent out. We have the locations that we were looking for as well. Now, regarding the authorities in the main budget, are any of them conditional to any legislative changes, or can you receive all that you're looking for without any legislative changes? The authorization for indeterminate staff, if there were any other amendments to the legislation and required additional resources, we would make requests at that time. But the permanent legislative or authorization allows us to react very quickly and recruit if ever we have any additional needs. Thank you.
Mr. Cram, 6 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Perreault, in your opening statement, you talked a little bit about the by-election in Terrebonne. I'd just like to follow up on that a little bit. So I understand that that particular by-election is going to have write-in ballots, the same system that was used in Battle River Crowfoot. Could you just explain a little bit about how that works? In particular, what happens if there's an I not dotted or a T not crossed or a minor spelling mistake in the candidate's name?
Yes, a very good question. As was the case then, variations in name, spelling, or errors are not problematic. They are not fatal flaw. The important thing is that there could be a clear identification of the intent of the voter. I can tell you that in Battle River Crowfoot, the rejection rate was 0.41%, which is one of the lowest we've ever seen. It's much lower than the national average on regular ballots with a checkbox, which is typically around 1%. So it was effective. Hopefully, it will be as effective then. So there is a very, very low rejection rate.
Okay, so but more than zero. Okay, but my concern is that in Battle River Crowfoot, the result was a bit of a landslide. In Terrebonne, the reason for the by-election is because of one vote. Are we not setting ourselves up for more opportunities for disputes in the actual counting of the ballots and even yet another by-election based on the change in the voting system?
So I would not use language setting ourselves up. I think we have good controls in place. It is possible that it's going to be a tight race. It's possible that there will be rejected ballots. There always are. But there were more rejected ballots in Battle River Crowfoot in the general election with the traditional ballot than there were with the write-in ballots. And some of them, apologies, some of these may be protest votes. We can't assume that they're all mistakes or improperly marked ballots.
And can you provide any more insight? Like, I don't understand why the reject rate would be higher for just marking an X versus writing someone's name. Like, could you explain why that would be possible? Is it all protests, do you think, or were there maybe fewer disputes in the by-election for some other reason?
I mean, it's a fascinating area of study. The rejection rates vary considerably between provinces. We know that for a fact, and that's hard to explain, though there are some explanations. There are typically 2 reasons to reject a ballot: if there's more than one mark, or if the mark is outside of the circle. Courts have tended, but there's no uniformity, to accept more than one mark if the intent is clear. So if they write off, for example, all of candidates, they scratch them off and they put an arrow and say, this is my choice, or they say error and scratch one and they say, here is my choice, they tend to accept that, but not consistently. Conversely, they tend to reject marks outside the ballot, and we saw that in Newfoundland, in Terra Nova, even though the intent is clear. So that's an area that Parliament may want to reconsider, because we don't have consistency among the judges, in some cases within the same judge. There are all kinds of factors that play into that. In Newfoundland, voters provincially mark that there's no circle, and so you can understand why there may be that tendency to use the same way of voting. All that to say, I really don't know exactly. We can't predict exactly how it's going to go.
So then, can you elaborate on what is being done to ensure a greater degree of consistency of accepting and rejecting ballots?
So that goes to the training, but again, the area that I'm concerned with is the inconsistency among judges and between those who do the count and the judges. So if we had consistency among the judges, we could instruct our poll workers in a given way. But without that consistency, it's very hard to do. We tend to be closer to the rule than the judges are, but that's a general trend. We in the case of Battle River and again in Terrebonne, we will provide additional training for the counting as we did, and that may well explain why it was such a low rejection rate. We did provide additional training both to the poll workers, but also additional information and instruction to the voters. So there was a high level of awareness around that election on how to vote and how to count those votes.
Okay. Well, that perhaps explains the lower rejection rate, but that's speculation, of course. So at this committee, we've had many discussions about the longest ballot committee and proposed changes to the signature sheets for becoming a candidate. Would you be able to table the signature sheets for the Terrebonne election or the Terrebonne by-election to this committee?
Certainly. They are publicly available, and so
Okay.
we will make them available to the committee.
Okay, very good. Mr. Chair, how am I doing for time?
20 seconds left.
20 seconds left. Okay, well, in that case, I would like to thank the witnesses for their time and their insights.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank Mr. Cram. Very optimistic when he woke up this morning. It was -7, and he picked out his springiest of ties. I do appreciate that. We'll turn to Mr. Wilkinson for 6 minutes, please.
All right, thank you very much. There are obviously some voters for whom there are accessibility concerns, whether that's Indigenous electors living on reserve, residents of long-term care facilities, students who are at college or university, and of course, persons with disabilities. I'm assuming that each election there is an assessment of what has been done and what perhaps more could be done to make these more accessible. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your assessment of the last election and whether there are additional improvements planned going forward.
So there were a number of initiatives that we did in the last election to reduce barriers. I'll mention the two main ones. One was to have the Vote on Campus program in a snap election context, which we'd never done before. We were able to do that in this election. We had 109 campuses across the countries who supported Vote on Campus. So we're going to continue to build on that. If there's an election this spring, we would have notionally the same or institutions. If the election is later on, we'd have the opportunity to expand that. It involves buying more resources and doing engagement with potentially new campuses. The last election, we also put a lot of emphasis on pre-event engagement with Indigenous communities to offer them advanced voting. In many cases, there was not in-community advanced voting, which in fact for remote communities meant there was no advanced voting because they would have to fly in or drive hundreds of kilometers. So it was a bit of an insult to put on the voter information card that they could vote at advanced polls so far away from their home. We were able to increase by 127% the number of early voting opportunities in communities for Indigenous and remote communities. We know that this did not work out in Nunavik, and so we are working to remedy that as we move forward. So at this point, we do not have new initiatives, but rather we are trying to perfect and expand on the initiatives that we brought in at the last election.
And just with respect to long-term care, I mean, many have voting stations in the care facilities. Is that something that is done for all, or how do you actually choose which ones actually get a polling station and which ones do not?
We try to offer it as much as possible in long-term care facilities. There are some situations where we want to have some flexibility for the timing of that. So this is a recommendation that I've made in the past, that we can determine with the local care facility that the best timing between advanced polls and ordinary polls, the best timing depending on situations or staffing, for example, capacity in long-term care facilities. So with the current limitations, we can't do that, except we did in a pandemic context with special adaptations. So there is a bit of rigidity around that system that I would like to have more flexibility on in order to improve the service.
Okay. Madame Normandin talked a little bit about Terrebonne and perhaps some of the barriers there, but we have 3 by-elections going on right now.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Wilkinson. Could you just lift your boom up a little bit? Thank you so much.
Can you hear me now better?
Thank you.
Okay. So 3 by-elections going on right now. Obviously, top of mind in terms of issues that you may have to deal with, because, of course, you don't know when by-elections are being called, would be the renting of space and the recruiting of workers. Have there been issues with that, but also any other issues that you've encountered that you have had to actually address as you've tried to ensure that we are going to have a good outcome from a process perspective?
Issues are issues. They arise when you least expect them, but in all cases to date, we had no issues in securing. We're able to secure the RO office, to equip them, to find the polling locations, and to do the recruitment. As I said, recruitment is not complete, but in all cases, the recruitment is complete for advanced polls, and they're making good headways for ordinary polls. So at this point in the 3 by-elections, there has not been any significant issue in terms of the administration of the vote.
Okay. One last question. I noted that there is a planned workforce reduction from, I guess it's about 1,502 people to 1,469 full-time equivalents going forward. Is this associated just with the modernization from an IT perspective that you've talked about? And how are you going to make sure that as you reduce staff, that the services you are providing are as fulsome as they have been?
Our staffing varies during the electoral cycle. So in terms of the number of people on strength during the election, it goes up to around 1,900. We're talking everybody, term, casual, contract. And then, of course, we reduce immediately after the election. And depending on the environment, we ramp up. And because these are people that are there for a very short period of time, it reflects differently on annual equivalents, what we call FTEs, full-time equivalents. And so you'll see in our staffing variations all the time based on the electoral environment.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will suspend for a few minutes to set up the next panel. Proceed to our next panel and would like to welcome our witnesses on our study of the current state of civic resilience in Canada. From Equitas International Center for Human Rights Education, Odette McCarthy, the Executive Director. From New Majority, we have Amanda Monday, the Executive Director. And from Samara Center for Democracy, Sabrina Dellin, Chief Executive Officer. And we will go in that order, so we'll start with Ms. McCarthy for 5 minutes, please.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs, les membres du comité.
Chair, committee members, thank you for inviting us to contribute to this important study on civic resilience in Canada. My name is Odette, and I am speaking on behalf of Equitas International Center for Human Rights Education. John Peters Humphrey, a Canadian and one of the co-authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, co-founded Equitas in the 1960s. He understood that it was not enough to adopt international declarations and conventions. People needed to be educated about their rights so that they could understand how these rights relate to every aspect of their daily lives and how to use them to build stronger communities and lives. For nearly 60 years, Equitas has been working in Canada and around the world to strengthen democracy and human rights through education. We work with over 200 partners across the country. And from this experience, one thing is clear. Civic education is one of the most powerful tools for building connected communities and strengthening social cohesion, renewing democratic participation, and building a stronger Canada. The challenge. According to the latest VDEM report, which was just published, Democracy Report 2026, Unraveling the Democratic Era, global democracy is facing increasing pressures. And no country can take its democratic achievements for granted. Although Canada maintains a strong position as an electoral democracy, it is essential to remain vigilant, especially in light of the rapid deterioration of the situation in the United States over the course of just 1 year. Canada, like many democracies, faces rising polarization and distrust of institutions, as well as growing social fragmentation. Statistics show that the levels of polarization and distrust of institutions are higher among young Canadians than among older generations. More than half of Canadians say they feel disconnected from their community, and that figure rises to nearly 7 in 10 among those aged 18 to 34. At the same time, young people clearly want to get involved. 3 out of 4 young people say it is important to participate in their community. Civic education programs are therefore essential as they bridge this gap by turning young people's interest into action and giving them the confidence, skills, and opportunities needed to take on leadership roles. This gap between interest and actual opportunities for participation is precisely where civic education plays a transformative role. Today, I'm going to talk to you about why civic education is essential. When we talk about civic education, we're not just referring to what happens in classrooms. Formal education is essential, but learning about democracy and strengthening that learning muscle is essential in community spaces between elections. When Equitas works with young people in communities such as Burnaby, BC, Montreal, Quebec, and Winnipeg, Manitoba, offering them human rights training and civic engagement, these young people want more. They are actively seeking out other resources and opportunities to get involved. Through these trainings and exchanges, young people learn more about Canada's governance structure, which strengthens their Canadian identity. This allows them to better understand civic engagement, critical thinking, democratic participation, the role of decision makers, and how to participate. Thus, our experiences and research demonstrate that when young people participate in civic and community activities, the benefits extend far beyond the immediate action. Civic education is essential to building a stronger Canada. When this link exists, Canadians, especially young people, are more likely to vote and get involved in democratic life. For democracy to work, young people must understand what democracy is, they must feel connected to their community, and they need to know that their voices matter. Strengthening a civic education is something that needs to happen every day. A resilient democracy is built before the vote, on election day, and between elections. Canadians need concrete opportunities to practice democracy, to discuss issues, to deliberate their differences, and participate in decisions that affect their lives. Yet today, certain democratic skills appear to be eroding. Polarization and divisive rhetoric are undermining these essential democratic skills. Canadians must be able to analyze complex issues such as natural disasters, migration, economic crises, or conflicts, and they need to find how to create collective solutions. This is an essential skill which is often overlooked, and
over your time, but you'll have plenty of questions that you can present the rest of your
Merci.
ideas
Donc,
and
en
thoughts.
conclusion, c'est vraiment comme donc de renforcer cet aspect.
Thank you. We need to strengthen that. Thank you.
We'll now turn to Ms. Monday. 5 minutes, please.
My name is Amanda Monday, and I'm the Executive Director of New Majority, a national nonpartisan organization conducting in-person youth voter mobilization at scale. I'll be honest, I'm not an academic expert, and I haven't spent decades in civil society. I spent my career in tech and founded a brick-and-mortar small business that navigated COVID lockdowns, wage subsidies, rent relief, and all of that fun. I came to lead New Majority because I understand what it's like to want to feel heard, but be excluded. There's no denying that youth are distanced from traditional democratic institutions. Voter turnout amongst 18 to 24-year-olds was only 46.7% in 2021. Go to a city council meeting and you'll be surprised to find a young person there. The more we are disconnected from democratic practices, the easier it is not to notice when we lose them. Participation, however, is not tied to a lack of motivation. During canvassing shifts, our team checks out with field managers at the end of their shift. One question that I often ask of field managers is, how many people that you talked to today knew an election was happening? Consistently, the answer is about half, though admittedly higher during the last federal election. That said, 50% of the young people that we meet on campus, outside gyms, in parks, do not know an election is underway. I want this committee to sit with that number because it reframes this entire conversation. It is not apathy gnawing at civic resilience and social cohesion. We have perception problems, access to quality information, and logistical challenges. Young people are not disengaged from issues. Youth unemployment last summer hit 17.9% for returning students. They are overwhelmed, anxious, and facing unmet promises from institutions they do not trust. In the 8 months between September 2024 and the federal election last April, my team talked to 760,000 young people. And in the federal election, we worked across 9 provinces on 22 campuses and in 50 ridings. In a bright spot, Elections Canada's just most recent 2026 report confirms that 18 to 24-year-old voter turnout jumped 9.2 percentage points to 55.9% in 2025. And first-time voters leaped from 44.8% to 55.3%, the highest overall turnout since 1993. Voting is gateway behavior. We're not just increasing turnout, we are building active citizens. A young woman named Kinira, who met her MP through our volunteer program, told us the experience helped her to realize that politicians are committed to the same communities that she's a part of. They report to her, not the other way around. 65% of our program participants reported increased hope after that single meeting with their elected official. 82% reported increased involvement in Canadian democracy. Authentic participation fosters a renewed democratic landscape. And I'm not stubborn enough to believe or insist that voting is a panacea. But not investing in civil society organizations who are bolstering democracy means that it will be far harder and more expensive to rebuild if civic engagement continues to spiral. I have 2 recommendations for this committee. First, reduce barriers to participating in electoral democracy to intentionally rebuild trust with younger voters. Vote Anywhere can do that. No eligible voters should decide not to vote or have trouble voting simply because they showed up at the wrong location, avoided a faith or education building, or just needed somewhere closer to work. Elections Canada has never studied how many voters are lost at the door for arriving at the wrong polling station, but we hear it anecdotally all the time. Mandate that party platforms be released before advanced voting begins. In the last federal election, advanced voting ran from April 18th to the 21st. 2 party platforms dropped on April 19th, the second day. Another wasn't released until April 22nd, after advanced voting had closed. 7.3 million Canadians cast advanced ballots before the parties had published a single page of policy. If we want truly informed voters en masse, we need to mandate access to quality, verified information in time to cast their ballots. Bolster programs like Vote on Campus, which, by the way, are my World Series days during any RIP period. They are hugely successful and require resources. Second and finally, establish a nonpartisan Canadian Democracy Fund and engage philanthropy across many issues Canadians care about. I am one of the co-developers of the National Endowment proposal. We are calling for a federal investment of $20 million a year, a fraction of what one federal election costs to administer, to support participation year-round, not just during a 28-day writ period. Canada's philanthropic sector is ready to support democracy programs at scale. What's missing is the government signal that creates the match. A federal commitment sends a message to foundations, corporations, and institutional donors that this is a national priority. Hope is not soft. Hope is the mechanism, and it requires your direct investment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Ms. Dellin for 5 minutes, please.
My name is Sabrina Dellin, and I'm the CEO of the Sonora Centre for Democracy, a nonpartisan charity dedicated to strengthening Canada's democracy through research and public engagement. Next year, we'll celebrate our 20th anniversary. My message to the committee today is that Canada has been complacent about protecting our democratic resilience, and we're paying the price with our national security and social cohesion. Fortunately, in this moment, there is an awakening that we must do better and can seize this moment to realize the next golden age for Canada's democracy. I offer 3 practical recommendations that can guide our efforts. First, we do not have a robust infrastructure to support an informed Canadian citizenry who are inoculated against threats to our sovereignty and democracy. As a result, Canadians are largely defenseless and ill-equipped to identify foreign information, assess inauthentic behavior online, and evaluate good information from bad. Our civic education offerings are deeply under-resourced across provinces and territories. This is hindering our ability to engage in healthy, evidence-based civic dialogue across differences. We can learn from fellow middle powers by investing in civic education as a national defense measure. We can secure a population of digitally literate, critical thinkers by committing to a robust revitalization of Canadian civic education. Picture children in elementary school learning digital media literacy across subjects, from social studies to math. All Canadian students should have access to curriculum that teaches them to understand and critically evaluate media content and disinformation in a Canadian context. This should be a crucial piece in our country's national defense plan against foreign threats and active disinformation campaigns. Second, every day, millions of Canadians' lives are shaped by foreign-owned social media platforms that limit access to credible Canadian news online while reducing fact-checking and content moderation. The proliferation of disinformation through bots and astroturfing is urgent and dangerous. These platforms must be regulated with significant economic consequences for non-compliance with safety requirements. In this new world order, Canada should coordinate with other values-aligned countries who are actively drafting design code policies that regulate digital platforms in the public interest. Finally, an informed and digitally literate citizenry needs access to social infrastructure where they can contribute to and benefit from a vibrant culture of civic engagement. Committing to civic capacity building is how we will secure social cohesion, enhance public trust, and bolster civic participation. This means having spaces like civic hubs where Canadians can connect with their representatives and receive coordinated public services. It's about accessible spaces where Canadians can be in community together, where disinformation can be checked through in-person conversation. It's about programs that enable active citizenship. To truly address the pressing civic needs of Canadians, we must invest in the chronically underfunded civil society organizations that are doing load-bearing work to shore up our democracy. We can scale the impact of civil society through the creation of a Canadian Democracy Endowment, a permanent, nonpartisan, arm's-length funding mechanism that would help to sustainably support Canada's civic resilience. In this moment of global democratic backsliding, many Canadians feel overwhelmed and disempowered. We can have an ambitious, bold, and strategic response by investing in robust civic education, forward-looking design code legislation, and civic infrastructure that will imbue Canadians, young and old, with the confidence that the future of our country is secure and ours to shape. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now turn to Mr. Jackson for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much to the three witnesses for being here today. I have a number of questions, some very interesting testimony there. I think perhaps we'll start maybe with Ms. Dellen, who went last there. I'm curious about your comment that Canada has been complacent and democracy and cohesion has suffered. Do you have specific examples of places where or other countries that have done a better job of regulating this than we have, and what that would look like in the Canadian context?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can look to Finland and Estonia for examples of how civic education has been prioritized in terms of lifelong learning and centered in terms of a commitment to national security. And this has been in response to foreign or threats and disinformation campaigns from Russia. And because of this decades-long commitment to civic education, these are countries that have very high rankings in terms of resistance to disinformation.
Thank you. I'm just curious, I am concerned about the impact of disinformation on Canada, and particular the fact that, as you mentioned, a new strategic partnership with some of those countries that are, as we are well aware, some of the largest interferers in Canada's elections. So do you have any specific concerns about what a change in Canadian foreign policy towards a closer alignment with those countries will mean for Canadian voters?
I think we need to think about what is our information ecosystem? How can we keep it healthy and secure? And how can we think about what is in the best interest of Canadians? So is your question about should we strengthen ties with countries that are interfering with our democracy?
Correct.
I think we should really focus on platform regulation in this regard and look to the EU for some cues here, because they established the Digital Services Act a few years ago, and this has served as a really important vehicle for countries to be able to move forward in positive ways. So examples right now is how France is exploring how to address disinformation around municipal elections across platforms. Many of those are foreign-owned in this instance. We've also seen recently that the Netherlands has confirmed that Meta has to provide chronological, not algorithmic, feeds. And Germany has also confirmed that X has to provide access to researchers. So this is an avenue through which we can look at the kind of borderless impact of mis and disinformation in the digital
So my
ecosystem.
question on that, I guess, is given how badly the digital services tax went when this Liberal government tried to impose that on, as you call them, foreign-owned social media platforms, sorry, Chair, do you have any confidence that this government could achieve something like that, any meaningful success? Because it's resulted in media organizations not being allowed to share their information on these platforms. And as that's proven out, Canadians have not stopped using these platforms just because they can't access that information from those sources on social media platforms.
My position here today is about upholding the public interest. This is a nonpartisan issue. It's a multi-generational issue, and it's really up to us to hold platforms to account and to behave in pro-democracy ways within our country. And so when I spoke about design code legislation, to expand on that, this is about placing the responsibility on platforms themselves to protect users from harm. No problem. Yeah, so I think it's important for us to hold the platforms to account here, because that often gets lost in the shuffle. And that there is design code legislation as a way for us to look at laws, regulations, and frameworks that are focused on user safety, privacy, and accessibility. This is about being responsive to the concerns of voters. As I mentioned, they feel overwhelmed, ill-equipped, and not safe online. And there's plenty of research that indicates that is there's evidence that's borne out. And so what is the response to supporting Canadians? How can we ensure that they are safe online and have access to high-quality information in those spaces?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and that kind of segues into Ms. Monday, because I am concerned about, the quality of information, perhaps, specifically if there's targeted campaigns on social media from foreign state actors. But you raised the issue of the party platforms and when they were unveiled. I'm curious if you think the scheduling of the leaders' debate also matters for young voters.
Absolutely. Any credible information that's verified from the parties themselves that we can get to voters, the better, especially outside of social media.
Well, I agree, but I'm also concerned about where the leaders' debates are streamed and access to them. I am 29, and Ms. Kayabag and I often debate whether that's a millennial or a Gen Z. We're not going to get into that today, but the point is, I don't subscribe to cable, and most of my generation and those younger than me don't. And so I'm wondering if you have specific suggestions on accessibility regarding these types of, as you call them, party credibility. I forget how you exactly worded it. But yeah, if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, so to the effect of debates, one of the things that we hear, New Majority's audience are unengaged voters. These are voters who have never voted before, who we consider, we often say we work on campus, they're not the poli-sci students. They're not the ones who are engaged. They don't go to debates, and they often find that debates themselves don't speak to policy promises as much as there's conversations between the candidates, which can be sometimes isolating for a new voter who's just getting into Canadian democracy, who says, I have issues, I'm concerned about whatever their personal issues are, and I'd like to see what the answers are. I also believe, absolutely, we need to create more access for all eligible voters to hear from all parties well in advance of advanced voting days so that they have as much information as possible, not needing to rely on outside sources, because we know on Meta you can't get outside news links. So you have to rely on unverified information.
Thank you so much. Madame Brière, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci à nos trois témoins d'être.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the three witnesses for being with us this afternoon. You definitely set the scene by talking about the increase of polarization, fragmentation, and the importance of strengthening our democracy. We need to protect the integrity of our democratic institutions. People do feel disconnected, but they also want to feel included. What are some of the challenges that we currently face? What are some of the underestimated challenges to civic participation, and what could we implement and be productive in order to overcome those challenges? Ms. McCarthy? there are definitely challenges regarding polarization, very divisive opinions. These are fed by disinformation and misinformation. Add to that barriers, for example, where somebody lives, their identity, their economic status. There are different barriers that can have an influence there. With civic engagement, we have tried to work with young people, and we want to share with them values, for example, universal human rights. And so that's how we set the table there, and we have discussions, tough discussions sometimes with these young people, and they don't necessarily agree, but they understand that they may have been misinformed, that they need to verify their sources, that they can respect different points of view, and they are able to develop some empathy for other people's points of view. And this builds that democratic skill that will serve them later if they end up in decision-making positions, or if they want to participate more actively in the electoral process, whether it be as a voter or someone who seeks a position. And so civil societies and other groups are working on this, but there are educational programs as well in our education system. We want to focus on a more active participation. We also want to have more public spaces, for example, in Brazil or South Africa, where different points of view are expressed. So we want to strengthen those spaces in order to strengthen the democratic process as well. We want to allow these young people to know what the spaces are where they can have an impact between elections, whether it be at a municipal level or community level. Thank you very much. You talked about funding. Your organizations all signed the declaration for the Canadian Fund for Democracy. I have the answer, but I am still going to ask the question. How could this fund help you in increasing civic participation, and what initiatives would you be able to put in place thanks to that funding? I'll start with Ms. Monday.
Thank you for the question. I'll answer in English if that's okay. It's difficult for any civil society organization to rely on only one stream of funding. So we have a mix of government and philanthropy funds. Certainly what we see the endowment fund doing is to be able to support civil society organizations long-term, not just in the boom and bust cycle. So in the case of philanthropy, many of our organizations end up being funded on project-based short-term funding. It might be for a few months, for a year, at best case over 2 years. What we're asking for with the endowment funding is $20 million a year, which is a fraction of what we just heard in the previous testimony from Mr. Perreault around the costs of an election. So being able to carry out civic engagement work year-round, doing work in the case of my organization on the ground, connecting people to democracy work outside of elections, like meeting with your MPs, like attending a budget consultation or a committee meeting. Many young people don't know about different ways to participate in democracy outside of voting, and we need the funding to be able to be on the ground to do that work every day over the long term.
J'ajouterais pour compléter ce qui est vraiment très intéressant.
Microphone, please. I would add that what's interesting with this fund is that, yes, it helps us, but it also bridges the gap from funding coming from the private sector as well. We need to have different players at the table in order to contribute and continue to strengthen democracy.
6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup aux trois panélistes. C'était particulièrement intéressant.
Thank you to the three panelists. I have questions for everyone, but I'll start with you, Ms. McCarthy. We know that democratic participation goes beyond voting, but it is essential as well, and one crystallizes their democratic habits after voting for the first time. Now, for young people, and this could require two answers, but should we lower the voting age so that a young person can vote while they're still in school and see what that process is? And should we also focus on a voting simulation so young people are able to vote on main issues like their parents? Are these initiatives that we could look into?
Merci, Madame Normandin.
Thank you, Ms. Normandin. I'll start by answering to the second part of your question, and I'll let my colleagues answer the first part. But yes, simulations do bear fruit. They are efficient, whether it be for an election or whether it be a simulation for decision making. These activities are very relevant and could be part of all of our school programs. That way, when young people are asked questions on democracy, they don't answer that they don't know what it means. They need to be able to fully experience that. Canadians need to be able to define in their own words what democracy is. So yes, that is a great initiative, but we need to also have more active spaces so that young people can share their concerns, any issues that they're facing, share their voices. I think that that's essential in order to build their capacity as they age.
Peut-être une question pour vous, Madame Monday.
Perhaps a question for you, Ms. Monday. Regarding leaders' debates, can you talk to us about the different platforms for the leaders' debate? It might be simpler to ensure that they happen before advanced voting, but for these platforms, do you have any potential solutions regarding parties and their platforms, how they can be shared more quickly? Because we can't stop somebody from becoming a candidate even if their platform hasn't been published. Do you have any potential solutions?
For the question, especially in the case of a snap election, as we saw at the last federal election, having all of the materials for voters in advance, in time before advanced voting days, is complex, and I understand that. That said, the challenge that we saw on the ground with the last federal election was advanced voting days happened before party platforms were officially released, and that meant it was very difficult for us to get information from all parties available to voters who had no prior experience in voting. What we often find with younger generations, the 18 to 24, they're not card-carrying party members. They potentially don't talk about being part of a party as a household. It's more about the issues themselves and the issues that are facing them in real time and in their future. So when it comes to debates and for party platforms, for what we hear most often from unengaged voters is, how are the candidates who are running going to help with the challenger issue I'm facing right now? And the challenge for organizations like mine and others who do nonpartisan work is we can't point to some candidate or party platforms and not the others. So we refer to Elections Canada's website as the main resource for all information, but it does not have information about the candidate platform. So we direct people to the party websites to get their information. We do encourage that they look towards debates, but as it's been noted here, if the debates are not, if they're only on cable, if they're not streamed online, if it's not accessible, it is possible that a young person will then look to unverified resources to make their decision. And it leaves organizations like ours that are nonpartisan, not working on persuasion, left to point to Elections Canada as our only resource. And Elections Canada's mandate is not to help voters with the platforms themselves.
Est-ce que ça pourrait être une idée d'avoir un endroit centralisé, par exemple?
Would it be possible to have a centralized area? Radio-Canada can ask questions to candidates, they can answer or not, and this allows everyone to better understand the different platforms, and the candidates can respond to questions, and it gives a better idea to voters regarding the different candidates.
The Vote Compass is on the CBC and Radio-Canada's platform. Again, any information that gets all party platforms to voters well in advance of advance voting days is my priority. The medium or the channel that it's on needs to be open for all eligible voters. And to me, it's that it can't be restricted. It can't be on only some social media platforms and not others. Perhaps shouldn't be on only social media at all. That we need to make sure it is within news organizations, that news organizations have the ability to reach all eligible voters in the places they are, where they get their news sources. We know young voters 18 to 24 are getting most of their news information from social media, but if verified news links are blocked, then they can't get verified news information, and they'll be linked to non-verified or non-credible sources, which is why we're asking that the information from parties in advance for ahead of advanced voting days be on your party websites, so that organizations like mine can link to the official sources, and we don't have to rely on whether or not a news source has that information.
Thank you so much. We're going to go into the next round. I'm going to be uncharacteristic and be strict with the timing so that we can get in a full round of questioning. So we'll start with Mr. Van Popta for 5 minutes, please.
Good, thank you. I better talk fast because he's going to be strict. So thank you to all the witnesses for being here and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and experience. Amanda Mundy, I'll start with you. So you were quoted in a CBC article on April 7th, 2025, so just 3 weeks or so before the election, an article written by Natalia Goodwin. And in it you were quoted as stating, quote, it is a misconception that youth don't want to vote, close quote. And I agree with that it is a misconception. And certainly my experience in the most recent election, 2025, particularly so. Young people seem to have been quite engaged, and I think that bears out in increased voter participation among young people, particularly first-time voters, as you pointed out. I went to quite a few political rallies and lots of young people there, and I actually had quite a team of young people, university students, even high school students out campaigning, door knocking, etc. But what did I hear them talking about was affordability. And I think you agree with that, too. In the same article, you're quoting affordability as being the top concern for the young people that you were engaged with. So today we're talking about civic resilience, but I'd like to tie it into economic security, or the lack thereof. Young people nowadays, they're the left-behind generation. They're feeling that they're not going to be as well off as their parents. So perhaps you could talk about the connection between a sense of financial security on the one hand and civic resilience and engagement on the other.
Thank you for the question. When we're talking about civic resilience and engaging with young people on the issues they care about, this is ultimately a conversation about trust in institutions. Will my elected official or elected officials at all orders of government, federal, provincial, municipal, respond to the issues I'm facing? One of the activities that my organization does outside of elections is we survey young people on exactly this. Are you planning to vote? Do you know an election's happening? What are the top issues that you care about? And so that changes. Their answers shift and change over time. But you're right. I have noted that affordability, mental health, and climate tend to come up in the top 3, not just with my organization, but we see this across a lot of youth-led organizations. So the job here in connecting civic resilience in those issues is, are elected officials answering the questions and concerns that young people have, and are they following through on the promises of change? And that's critically important when it comes to civic resilience, because what we have is a lack of trust in institutions. Yes, I'll vote, but will my vote contribute to solving the actual issues that I'm concerned about right now? And so to me, the focus when we're talking about civic resilience needs to be on what are we doing to rebuild trust in institutions between voters, especially new voters.
This is a good segue for me to quote a trusted institution, at least I think it's a trusted institution in Canada, and that is the Bank of Canada. And I want to quote Carolyn Rogers, who is the Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. This is a 2-year-old speech that she gave about productivity or lagging metrics of productivity. And productivity is a term economists use to say, how efficient is the economy running? Is it running on all cylinders or is it sputtering along? She said an economy with strong productivity can have faster growth, more jobs, higher wages with less risk of inflation. And that's why I want to talk to Canada about Canada's long-standing poor record on productivity and slow growth. And so again, right, this is the economy that young people are growing up in, and you know, is there some tie-in between that and their disconnection from wanting to be engaged or their distrust in institutions?
I can't speak to economic policy. I'm an expert on mobilizing young people to the polls and what happens to get specifically young people who are unengaged. It's that audience, that 50% now from the last one, 45% of young people who didn't vote, who don't know an election is happening. The way to mobilize that audience is logistical in nature and not connected to motivation or persuasion on why or how someone should vote. What my expertise is on finding the voters who don't know an election is happening or are overwhelmed by the process and act of voting for the first time. And you're right, as I quoted in my opening remarks, unemployment for youth, for returning students last year was 17.9%. We see...
True to my word, I apologize.
You're right.
I'm going to be ruthless in this round. I apologize. So we'll turn to Mr. Lewis for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses appearing for this committee and also for your contributions to within your organizations, improving civic life in Canada. We're talking about healthy democracy, and it depends on strong institutions, but also active participation to public decision-making. This study is an important opportunity to explore how community initiatives and civic education can help Canadians feel more informed, included, and confident in participating in our democratic process. So I do appreciate your recommendations on how to strengthen social trust and increase civic engagement. It's not lost on me that we have a panel of strong women here. Yet at the same time, women in Canada continue to be underrepresented in many civic and political spaces. Maybe I would start with Ms. Dillon. Back in 2014, Samara produced a book, Tragedy in the Commons. One of the topics discussed was toxic parliamentary culture. So we haven't talked about this, but what is the responsibility of elected officials, including parliamentarians, exiting MPs? Consistently described Parliament, specifically question period, as childish, immature, and counterproductive, a spectacle that discourages citizens from following politics and reinforcing cynicism. What responsibility do elected officials have to set an example so people do want to get involved both civically and also put their names forward and we can get maybe more women in politics?
Thank you for that question. So that book is part of our long-standing project, the MP Exit Interview Project. A couple of years ago, we released a podcast with more recent interviews called Humans of the House, and we heard our interviewees use words like nightmare and cage match to describe their conditions of work. We've also monitored abusive tweets that candidates have received online in Canadian elections. So there's plenty of evidence, quantitative and qualitative, about how dire and arduous these conditions of work are. And when we think about Parliament as a workplace, that can seem like a really disruptive notion, because the work that happens in Parliament is exceptional and important, but it has to be grounded in a standard of labor that is effective and productive, and really ensuring that is a way to demonstrate respect to the electorate. The health of the culture of work for our elected officials is directly tied to the health of our democracy. And that's then linked to trust that the electorate has in their elected officials. So in terms of policies that would make a big difference, I was a witness previously before this committee on looking at the MP harassment policies and regulations, what can be done on that front. Also to speak to the fact that the public really isn't interested in, kind of partisan sniping and, getting clips for social media and all that kind of stuff. The public just wants to know that there is a effective, collaborative, and efficient orientation amongst their elected officials, that there's collegiality there. And one thing that does come through our exit interviews with former members of Parliament is when they speak about how much they drew satisfaction from committee work, how the informal instances of their engagement with one another was really productive and really underscored that their commitment to public service was an important one. And if there's a way for us to expand on that and scale that and make that the story that the public hears about their elected officials, that they're responsive to their needs and that they are working hard instead of a lot of what we end up seeing on social media instead, that would make a big difference. And also to note that women don't decline opportunities to run for office because they're a shrinking violet or they're not sure. They can be treated better and get paid better elsewhere. So it's a very strategic decision. The need for public service is absolutely there. The interest is there. The passion is there. The community is behind them. But they really have to take a moment to consider whether they want to expose not just themselves, but their families and loved ones to the inevitable vitriol that they will receive. And our research has also shown that what women receive as candidates and elected officials is far more personal and misogynistic than their counterparts that are male.
Well, I did read the book in 2014, and it was one of the reasons drivers to put my name forward. So thank you for that. I'm out of time.
You are out of time.
I have many more questions, but thank you.
Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. J'ai une question qui est peut-être un peu...
Thank you very much. I have a question for you, Ms. Dillon. We talked about disinformation and social media. For Facebook, if we're a political entity and we want to have ads during an election campaign, we need to identify as a party or a candidate on the Facebook page before sharing these ads. And so the rules are already quite difficult to meet, whereas anybody else can publish whatever they want. So should that be part of the reflection during an election campaign? What could be shared on social media so that we can avoid bots that amplify certain messages?
I'm afraid I'll have to answer in English. Thank you. So I think this is, your question is about the digital literacy of Canadians, because many Canadians don't know that if you're putting anything on Facebook that has a political dimension to it, it has to be shared, and then you enter into a kind of complex bureaucratic space where you have to try to figure something out. Similarly, many Canadians don't know that you can't share news on Facebook. So if we can enhance the digital literacy of Canadians across generations, that will make a big difference in terms of ensuring that citizens are discerning as they navigate political conversations across different platforms. Another aspect that's, coming out of our discussions today is that we don't have to be bound to these existing platforms. Canada has a very fantastic history in terms of technological innovation and public broadcasting. We can have our own social platform. We can be in alignment with other middle power countries that are similarly exploring pro-social platforms. So instead of bending these existing platforms to fit into or align with our democratic values, if they won't do it, then we have to make a decision that's in the best interest of Canadians and in our democracy. And it's not a bridge too far to consider that we have our own platform that becomes a reliable source of information that young people know they can go to watch the leaders debate and get the information that they need, something that is responsive to the needs of Canadians. So I think it's really a shame our democracy is so important. Why are we letting a company like Meta decide what information we are able to share with Canadians? So I think we really need to shift this and ensure that we have a digitally literate population that is discerning across these platforms. And we are ambitious and courageous about the kind of spaces we want to have to support the democratic participation of our citizens.
Thank you so much. Mr. Cooper, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to direct my questions to Madame Monday. I thought I heard you say in your opening statement that Canadian civic engagement continues to spiral downward. If I heard you right, on what basis do you draw such a conclusion? What metric are you using?
When we talk about civic engagement, we're looking at all the places where young people in particular are participating in democracy. So voting and turnout is one metric, and it did go up in the last federal election. That said, if you look at a municipal election, the national average in turnout for a municipal election sits at around 33%. When we look at budget consultations, city council meetings, many different areas, meeting with MPs, not to lobby on a specific platform or policy issue, but just to meet your MP and say, I am a constituent in your riding. These are the issues that matter to me, and I'd like to understand how you're governing and just to get to know me as a person, especially when you're in a smaller community. We hear this a lot from smaller communities and young people who want to know who's leading us.
So it seems rather anecdotal, your conclusion that civic engagement continues to spiral downward. You cite municipal elections. Well, it's not new that there's low participation in municipal elections. If you look at voter turnout, I can look at my province of Alberta, for example. I could go back to the 1986 election where voter turnout was under 50%. 40 years ago, we've had much higher turnout in more recent elections in Alberta. You highlighted, which is what prompted my question as to how you drew that conclusion, that voter participation amongst 18 to 24-year-olds increased by 9.2% in the 2025 election, and that for first time voters, the participation rate was up from somewhere in the mid-40s to the mid-50s. That doesn't sound like civic engagement is spiraling downward. It sounds like there's some positive trends.
There are positive trends, and we'll always celebrate the positive. It is still also true that voter turnout for 18 to 24-year-olds is 10 points behind 35 to 40 voters aged 35 to 44. So we still have work to do when it comes to engaging young people. If more than half or close to half of a voting population isn't turning out to the polls, we still have an issue. Also, as my colleagues noted here, civic education in schools needs to be updated. Awareness of elections can be updated. We have lots of areas where we need to bolster civic engagement so that we can support lifting turnout to way higher than 55%.
I agree with you. At 55%, there is work to do. But looking at the positive trend from the 2025 election with increased participation among young people, what went right? What can we learn from 2025 to build upon greater participation in future elections?
That's a great question. One of the things that we've noted from Elections Canada is that the return of vote on campus in the 2025 election was a positive, and I would absolutely I would echo the sentiment that having vote on campus is critical. Elections Canada noted that they were on 109 campuses across the country for the federal election. There are more than 109 campuses across this country, but what we need is time to prepare and support from the institutions to be able to have vote on campus in more places so that students, young people in that demographic that are the lowest voting demographic can vote easily. And it's why I support Vote Anywhere and Vote on Campus.
A minute?
If you'd like.
Okay.
50 seconds.
Well, I'll just invite the other witnesses to pick up if they have any thoughts on trends, what went right, what opportunities there are to build upon greater participation in the democratic process.
In 30 seconds.
The election was speaking to the dire and urgent concerns of young people that Amanda has indicated, and also just to add that when young people are onboarded to the role of active citizens, they benefit everyone around them, their peers and the adults in their lives that might be feeling intimidated or disaffected by the political process.
And I would just add really quickly, I would invite all the members of this committee, if you haven't had a chance, to read The Unraveling of the Democratic Era, which is the latest democracy report written by VDEM. It provides interesting information and just overall trends that are happening worldwide that we can agree or disagree on necessarily, but it gives that sense of the trends and some metrics that are related to that. And I'd just finish by saying that Canada can exist, fully and embrace its democracy if it's living in a community worldwide of other democracies. So it's really important for Canada to kind of play that leadership role with other countries to continue to preserve that.
Thank you so much. Madame Brière, 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci pour
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for this very interesting discussion. In countries where civic participation is high, there are 3 things that can be found. High trust in institutions regarding transparency, integrity, proximity. Secondly, the real power that is given to citizens. For example, citizen assemblies to discuss sensitive issues, for example, abortion, medical assistance in dying, climate, and giving people an opportunity to discuss financial decisions. And thirdly, which might not require, or rather making things very accessible. Do you believe that these 3 things are currently being applied in Canada to improve participation?
Oui. Alors, moi, je vais...
I would like to quote someone from Hazelton in BC who participated in some of our organized activities and said that the activity helps young people feel engaged, allows them to understand their value. They leave feeling more confident. So this person was talking about what she had observed. So they have better self-esteem as well. And that comes back to what you said about trust. They also feel more responsible in creating the community that they want to live in. So when we take the time with organizations and schools, if there's time that is allotted for that, then it can strengthen the system and strengthen engagement in one's community. And yes, we are doing it in Canada, but not enough. And we need the resources in order to do that. We need support coming from the government, but also, as was mentioned, support from the private sector in order to continue strengthening the system. We are very proud as Canadians, but our system is fragile, and we need to maintain it and strengthen it. Thank you. Miss Amanda or Sabrina?
Well, just to add that civic resilience and active citizenship is more than just voting in elections, and that Canadians, especially young people, are looking for opportunities where they can be heard and to have that responsiveness. And it's not necessarily that they get whatever they want, but that they just feel a connection to the process. And also, just to add in terms of the Canadian Democracy Endowment, it's not just about government support, but the huge potential to unlock philanthropic support for scaling of civil society. For some of the people that you've heard from this study, there's some private support, but I know in the instance of Samara Centre, that's not reliable, and that can change, with the weather. But philanthropic and government support and other community partnerships are really integral to ensuring that nonpartisan civil society work can be scaled in a meaningful way.
I want to add that when we're talking about trust, you're right, in healthy democracies, we also need to look at polarization. And I have here an interesting study from January 2026 from Digital Public Square, who released that the average Canadian rates our country's polarization at 6.5 out of 10. 55% believe it's getting worse. But actually, the report also found that Canadians are far less ideologically divided than we perceive ourselves to be, which is interesting because what that means is that the perception of citizens being polarized is greater than how polarized we actually are. So when we're looking at democratic engagement programs, especially outside of electoral engagement, we need to address the perception of being polarized. The same way if you are to build an AI learning course or program to study misinformation, you want to look at, do you feel you're susceptible to misinformation, not spot the deepfake, because AI changes so fast. So we need to really look at how are we addressing how Canadians feel about our institutions and the perception that we're more polarized than we actually are.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank our witnesses for an excellent discussion. This committee stands adjourned.